They call it the town that disappeared. All we could find was a shattered footprint at the end of a washed-out road.
It just doesn't stop.
Some 17,000 people used to live and fish here. Now close to half of them, it's feared, are under the mud. The racing wall of water, some 30 feet high, was only about a half hour away when the warning went out. At the city's main hospital, that wasn't enough time. The water took everybody, this nurse told us, all the patients. She only survived by getting as many patients as high as she could, as fast as she could.
That was NBC News correspondent Lee Cowan reporting on Nightly News from Minamisanriku. He joins us now on the phone from there in northern Japan. Lee, thank you so much for talking with us tonight. It's good to have you on the phone with us.
Thanks, Rachel. Good to hear from you.
Thanks. I know you were one of the few reporters to make it all the way north to the part of the country most devastated by this earthquake and tsunami, Lee. What's happening on the ground today? Is this search and rescue? Is this cleanup? Or is this just getting food and water to survivors? What's happening?
You know, Rachel, at least the places that we've seen, there is no real search and rescue effort going on. The town that we were in yesterday, as you saw, is so devastated. I think, sadly, some people have almost just given up. The only people that we really saw on the ground there that were doing anything were the few survivors that were trying to go back and pick through what they could find, if anything, and take it with them to a shelter. We did see choppers circling overhead. Some of them we thought were U.S. choppers. We couldn't quite tell because they were pretty high. But other than that, that's really the only movement. It was deathly quiet, silent, no activity. There is some effort to try and bulldoze some of the debris out of the way so that people could get in and out. But those seem to be largely volunteers for the most part. Many of the checkpoints that we arrived at to try and get to the coastal regions were manned also by volunteers. So it seems as though whatever...
I think we've just lost Lee. If we can get Lee back from northern Japan, we will absolutely do that. Do we have Robert Bazell actually joining us now from Tokyo, who's just done a report on Nightly News tonight about this third blast at the Fukushima reactor in northern Japan. Bob, what can you tell us about what we've learned tonight?
Well, Rachel, it's ominous news. The company that owns the power plant said that one of the reactors, reactor number 2, where there was an explosion yesterday, it's early morning now in Japan, at a press conference this morning, they said that explosion was not like the other 2, which was in outside buildings. It was actually in the dome that is supposed to contain the radiation, and that radiation has now leaked out into the environment. As a result of that, they evacuated the plant except for the most core staff that they could keep there. Now, I have to point out that the amount of radiation so far that they say has been measured is nothing like there was at Chernobyl that caused dozens of deaths in a few weeks and then thousands over time. It's a high level of radiation, a dangerous level of radiation, but this changes the situation enormously. We no longer have a possible bad outcome. We have a bad outcome. And in terms of rating this nuclear disaster now going on, and it's nowhere near ended here in Japan, is worse than 3 Mile Island in the sense that very little radiation escaped from 3 Mile Island. It's not as bad as Chernobyl, but it's now the second worst nuclear disaster ever known, and it's not going to be shut down anytime soon. Rachel?
Bob, to be clear, what we have on site at these facilities, we've all learned so much about them in reporting on this in the past few days, is the internal containment vessel, which is right around the reactor. There is also a secondary containment vessel, which is in effect the building that surrounds the entire reactor complex. For us to have had a significant radiation leak out into the environment, or does that mean that officials are saying that both of those containment units have been breached, both the outer building and the smaller reactor containment vessel that's right around the dome?
That's a good question, and it's not clear at all that the smaller one has been breached yet. But what's happening is that because the core nuclear material in there, which had been an ongoing nuclear reaction was shut down, but it's still extremely hot, and they've been trying to cool it off with seawater. And when they pour seawater in there, sometimes enormous amounts of steam builds up. So it could have just been a blast of steam and hydrogen out of that metal reactor into the other one, and the hydrogen tends to explode, and that could have been what caused the breach. So there's no indication yet that inner critical metal one has been breached, but they are talking about the nuclear material inside melting, and it's so hot that it could potentially melt the metal. Now, that's potentially. We don't know what's happened. Every physicist is pointing out that we are now in uncharted territories. We're in a situation that's never happened with a nuclear reactor, except for 3 Mile Island, which was contained with less release of radiation than we've already had here. So we need to get more details. The press conference was not difficult. It was not easy to follow because it was in Japanese, and then they were skirting a lot of issues. And I think, honestly, they don't really understand themselves what's happening, which, of course, always makes these situations even more frightening than they already are, Rachel.
Bob, as you say, the reactor core continues to be very, very hot, which is why they have been adding seawater to it. With the type of explosion they have had and the type of damage they think they have had, can they continue their efforts to keep those fuel rods submerged in seawater? Can they keep doing, in effect, mitigation work there to try to prevent further damage to the fuel rods, further meltdown? Or does this mean that their ability to even keep that seawater in there is also impaired?
The answer to that is I don't think anybody knows that right now. What happened with this reactor number 2 that's gotten into these big problems is that the water circulation that normally works to keep it going had been continuing with some kind of power generation in that one reactor. And they thought that was working, but apparently it failed. They announced 2 things yesterday. They announced that the water circulation had failed, and then later on they announced that there was an explosion. Now the explosion seems to have been inside the reactor. So this reactor was behaving differently. They thought they had it under control with water. The water wasn't working. The fuel rods became exposed, so they had to start trying to pump in seawater. And when they started trying to pump in seawater was when things went very badly awry. And so whether they can still pump in seawater or what happens next, they haven't said, and I think they probably just don't know right now, and they're trying to figure it out.
Are you expecting, Bob, that we will get any sort of quantitative measure of how big the radiation release has been, either from international officials or from Japanese officials?
They gave a quantitative figure today, and it's about around the reactor. It's about as much radiation as a human being is typically exposed to in a year. We get radiation from natural sources. You get radiation from when you fly in airplanes, when you get an X-ray. So we're not talking about the kind of radiation that makes people drop dead or even increases their cancer risk substantially. But if in 1 hour you're getting as much as you get in a year, clearly that's a lot of radiation in that immediate area. The radiation levels will go down as it gets dispersed. And there is another thing that's happening here today, which is there's a storm coming in, a weather pattern, and it's shifted the winds on the ground that had been blowing radiation out to sea. It switched them to the west, which is blowing it inland over this area that's already suffered so severely from the earthquake and tsunami. So as if those poor people didn't have enough to contend with, now they have serious amounts of radiation coming their way. Even though as it disperses, if it remains at that level, it's not a serious matter when it gets a few miles away from the plant. So what they've done, they've evacuated the area around it already, as we know. They've given out iodine pills, which is a preventive measure for thyroid cancer, and there's not a whole lot more that can be done right now. And if it doesn't get to be a lot higher levels of radiation, it's not a problem. But again, I'm repeating, everybody says this is unknown territory. There's never been a reactor that's behaved like this before, and as a result, no one knows where it's going next.
NBC's chief science correspondent Robert Bazell in Tokyo for us. Thank you so much for helping us understand this, Bob. I really appreciate it. We will be right back with Congressman and physicist Rush Holt right after this.